I'm Greg Fossilman Raymer. In the last lesson, we looked at how pot odds dictate our actions by providing a mathematical justification for us to call or fold on any given street in any hand. And while the math behind pot odds is undeniable, the fact is it's not always exact. Why? Because pot odds don't account for the amount of money that we might win on future streets after we make our hand. That's where implied odds come in. Implied odds are a double-edged sword for many players. On the one hand, they know that making a mathematically incorrect call on the flop or the turn can earn them additional money on the turn or the river. But on the other hand, they use the possibility of earning extra money later in a hand as an excuse to make a bad call now and to chase more hands than they should. So the question is, when is it right to play for implied odds and when is it wrong? That's not always easy to answer, but there's a few guidelines that can help you determine when chasing your hand may be more profitable than folding. First, your opponent needs to have a deep enough stack to make chasing your hand worthwhile. Second, you have to believe that your opponent has a strong enough hand that he will pay you off when you do make your hand. To calculate implied odds, we look at the amount of extra chips that we think we can get our opponent to commit to the pot if we make our hand, and we add those chips to the chips that are already in the pot when we're making our decision. Let's go back to the example we used in our lesson on pot odds, where our opponent had bet 600 into a pot of 600. With our straight and flush draws giving us 15 outs, we determined that with pot odds of 2-1, we weren't getting quite the right price to call in this spot. Now, let's add implied odds into the equation and say that our opponent still has 1,500 chips left in his stack after he bet 600 on the flop. If we think that we can get him to call off the rest of his stack every time we make our hand, we can add those 1,500 chips to the 1,200 chips that were already in the pot and use that to determine our odds. So, assuming now a pot of 2,700 chips, we are getting implied odds of 4.5-1, which is more than enough to justify a call with both our straight and flush draws. Remember though, your opponent won't always be willing to commit his entire stack to the pot every time you make your hand, which means you have to be careful about estimating the size of the pot you're likely to win. If you get too greedy or too optimistic, you can quickly find yourself making too many marginal calls in search of paydays that just aren't going to happen. Another thing to remember is that there are times when you may encounter negative implied odds. These are the times when you make your hand only to have your opponent also make a better hand, such as a higher flush or a higher full house. Negative implied odds are especially important in pre-flop play, where you may be likely to play easily dominated hands like King-Jack just because you think you're getting the right pot odds. In these cases, hitting your top pair on a ragged flop can end up costing you a lot of money if your opponent has you outkicked. In these cases, the best advice is not to play these hands, especially out of position.